Welcome back to the table. Today we're taking a look at two hot new dungeon crawling games. These games both recently released, and we were given the base editions of both of these games. And today we wanted to kind of compare and contrast these two games. That would be Massive Darkness 2 Hellscape and Bardsung.
Yeah, Bardsung. I'm here, by the way. I'm hiding behind Bardsung.
This giant box.
It doesn't take much to hide behind this because the box is enormous. I mean, the box for Massive Darkness is no slouch itself. It's pretty big. Well, it's massive, but it's not this massive.
I know. So, however, we can't judge a book by its cover. We can't judge a game by the size of the box it comes in. There is a lot of content in Bardsung when it comes to just the sheer amount of miniatures. And Steamforged Games is known for just giving a ton of really finely crafted miniatures.
I mean, so does... Come on.
That's true. There are a bunch of miniatures in here as well. I actually wonder what the count is between them.
We might put those stats up on the screen at some point.
This is definitely... I haven't opened this box yet. So, spoiler alert. I have not opened this. I'm going to guess that this box is so big because some of the minis are probably giant.
A couple. One in particular is very big. But we'll get to that, and we're going to show you a little bit about what each of these games has to offer. But I'm going to caveat all of this. We haven't played these games yet. You have some experience with Massive Darkness.
Yeah, we literally just got these. I have played through the Massive Darkness 1 campaign, if you want to call it that. It was a series of linked scenarios.
Barely linked.
Very finely linked, like a Zombicide.
Yeah.
Like playing from one mission to the other in Zombicide. But I did play through all of that and really did enjoy my experience. But I've had my eye on Bardsung for a while.
Yeah, Bardsung, one of the things that they both have in common are they're very straightforward to play. This one has a fair amount more going on. But like I said, we're going to dig into all of that. I have learned a little bit more about Bardsung. I've skimmed the rules to Massive Darkness too, so I'm going to rely on Ryan to tell you about that. But Bardsung is also fairly simply structured, but it seems like it has a more connective campaign for sure.
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and quickly open up these boxes, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about what's in each one and kind of allow you to decide maybe which one is better for you, or you might just get both.
And like that, we are back now with the games unboxed, mostly unboxed anyway. We've got enough bits and pieces from both games out here, I think, to discuss what the games have going on, to give you an idea of what each is like and how they're similar and how they're different.
Yeah, I think if we pulled all the content from both of these boxes, we would run out of table space.
It would be a mess.
Quickly.
It's a mess as it is. It would be a disaster.
There is a lot of content, but I want to jump right into it. I said before that I thought maybe Bardsung had bigger minis. I pulled out what I think is the biggest mini in the Massive Darkness 2 box, which is this one. This is right here.
And this is the biggest mini from Bardsung. And I don't think...
it's not as much bigger as I thought.
None of this is spoiler alert stuff because it's right there in the box as soon as you open it.
Yeah, this is right in front of the box.
You're not going to miss this. It's not in its own separate box. This guy, though, is a pretty hefty miniature for sure. He's...
that's solid.
He's
super
weighty.
Solid.
But I think both of these companies have done a really good job with the miniature.
It's Steamforged, and come on. I don't think either one of them have gone really wrong in their miniatures. It's not as much bigger as I thought, but it is bigger. I mean, and definitely when you're looking at the comparison to the player characters.
Yeah, I've got a couple player characters here too.
I think these are it's basically kind of the same scale here, really. I mean,
yeah, it's effectively the same scale. One thing I would say after having taken a quick peek at the miniatures in both, there's I think a slightly wider variety of different characters and creatures in Bardsung, but not multiples of many. Well, there's a few that have a couple, but then in Come On, there's here's this type of miniature, and there's 20 of them.
Well, so I think that kind of dials into one of the main differences between these games, and we'll talk about this, but I like to consider, I think of Massive Darkness 2 as kind of more of an arcadey experience.
Yeah.
You're fighting your way through waves after wave of enemies, kind of like Zombicide. And I will compare this game to Zombicide a lot. Not that it plays like Zombicide, but it does give a similar kind of plug-and-play experience.
Yeah.
Where you're choosing a scenario, and there are 10 scenarios in this book, and you're battling your way through it. You're leveling up through it. You're gaining a bunch of new items and equipment and abilities as you're going through that particular scenario, and you're fighting just a ton of guys. So it does have that Zombicide feel of just you have your sword and you're just cutting down people left and right.
It is a dice chucker in the traditional sense.
Really, you're building these huge dice pools. You're you're getting dice from all these different sources. You're rolling all these dice. You're doing damage. I would say that's a very different experience than what you're getting in Bardsung.
I mean, it is and it isn't. I think I've looked at the Bardsung rules quite a bit, and a lot of those things exist. It's not as massive, no pun intended, but you're not getting a lot of hordes and hordes of things coming at you. You go into a room, there may be some skill tests, there may be a battle. You're going to reveal those rooms one at a time too, which is another big difference between the two. But the biggest difference overall is instead of an arcade experience, this is a big, robust campaign
you
experience.
said that this game was not massive, but I'm looking at the adventure book here.
Yeah, if you can see here, we have the rule books, and then I'm going to move the rule book for Bardsung to reveal the
I don't know if I could call that anything other than massive.
adventure book, and this thing is huge. So this has a bunch of far more connected. I mean, these are not just in and of themselves scenarios. You are supposed to play.
Oh yeah, it's a narrative campaign.
It's a big campaign. It's got there's going to be things that happen during scenarios. There's over 300 narrative entries, and those may come into play. They may not, because depending on decisions and things you do in this game, there are actually, and I'm not going to say how many, but there are multiple endings to the overall campaign depending on different decisions you make and different things you achieve.
Yeah, that's a huge difference. I mean, there really is no narrative in Massive Darkness, but it's also not designed for that experience. It's designed to be very simple. You set it up. In fact, I've got all these tiles over here. You're just basically laying out these tiles, and you're just connecting these tiles in different ways to build a map. And one of the major differences here is you see the whole map in Massive Darkness. Like Zombicide, you set up the whole map, you put out the doors, you put out some points of interest. All of that is revealed before you even take your first turn.
Yeah, the only thing that's not revealed in Massive Darkness, correct me if I'm wrong, is the things that are in those rooms.
Yeah,
right?
as you open doors and as you progress through the level, you're going to be drawing monster cards and door cards, and things will happen. Traps might trigger. Monsters will start to flood in for you to fight. Yeah, and you'll find a lot of gear and equipment hidden in there as well.
Yeah, so the big difference in that respect here is, and I'm not going to open all of this, but I'll put up a picture. This has one big massive board. Now, this board is really just effectively a canvas for the game itself, because it's really just a big table. It has some things around the edges so that you can place initiative cards.
I do like where they have that built on the board.
Yes, that is very nice. But the big main section, it's also two-sided too, because one section is for like the dungeon delves, and then there are boss encounters that happen on the other side, which are a big sort of arena type situation.
That's very different than you'll find in Massive Darkness.
Yeah. But as you're playing this game, you are actually revealing the map. So you start in a room, at least in the scenarios I've seen, and then one of the actions you can take is to explore if you want. There's very few actions. That's one thing they have in common. But when you explore, you're able to get another tile out. And how do you determine that? Well, there's these cards, and in a normal scenario, you're going to have decks of these cards. And if you're in a room, you flip over a corridor tile card. And if you're in a corridor, you flip over a room card. And it tells you what type of tile to pull from the stack of tiles to place out. And sometimes it's going to tell you, kind of limit where you can place it. Some of it's going to let you place it however you want. You can orient it however you want, those sorts of things. Because what you're doing is you're building the tiles in most scenarios in order to get to the other edge of that big board.
Oh yeah, so you're kind of really building the map as you go. It almost has it's almost like procedurally generated. Like that's a really popular kind of system in video games right now, where you don't really know what's next. Every time you play that scenario, it's going to be a little bit different. Whereas, again, in Massive Darkness, it is going to be the same, but what's different is going to be the makeup of your characters. You're going to be getting different gear.
Yeah.
And if you're playing different characters, you're going to be bringing in different components even, which is a big difference between Massive Darkness 1 and 2, which let me talk about that really, really briefly, because at their core, these games are kind of similar in that you're moving through rooms, you're exploring, you're taking actions to fight and attack and interact with things, basically. But Massive Darkness, let's bring out this this player aid so you can kind of see. This is what it looks like for Massive Darkness. You've got all your items, your character card, your level. All of that is presented here on this. But then you have an additional component, which for the Paladin is a board like this, where you're actually able to play out blessing cards and then bless areas on the board. So every one of these characters has very unique mechanics that they bring into the game, and that kind of leans into that like arcadey choose your character kind of experience.
Cool. That's really cool. And we haven't read the rules thoroughly, but like even the wizard has a totally different component here, which is where I guess you're effectively preparing your spells. Yeah, you're like
preparing spells and they're going to trigger.
Yeah, it has this dial that rotates, and that is a really cool aspect. That is one of the most compelling things that makes me want to play Massive Darkness. Now, Bardsung has also kind of a tray-based player board system. They have a game tray solution. And you're going to see here, it's modular. It has a little lid that can fit on it, so you can sort of like save the components between scenarios. But you're going to place your character card here. Underneath your character card, you might put some ability cards that you don't have access to yet, or some equipment that you aren't equipped with.
Storage, basically.
Something like that. And then over here, you're going to put some of your equipment, and then over here, your ability cards. And then right here, you see sort of your characteristic tokens, where you're going to have your charisma, your strength, things like that. At the beginning of the game, each character is going to have like maybe a +2 charisma and +1 to this stat. So you actually get those tokens out of the board, and this is how you track that progress. It can go up to like +1, +2, +3, +4. Those are going to come into play, obviously, with skill checks and things like that.
Don't even exist in Massive Darkness.
That are based off of those abilities. For instance, the Guiding Strike here keys off of charisma. So he's going to get a +2, he or she is going to get a +2 to their rolls when they're using the Guiding Strike, things like that.
I think that's one big difference between these games, too, is that Massive Darkness is more of a dice pool builder. When you're attacking, you're just attacking. And yes, you're going to have some ability cards that you can use potentially based on what you're playing. I mean, look, we didn't even talk about the Rogue has like a bag building. So you're doing different things to attack, but ultimately all of it is trying to build out these dice pools and roll a certain amount of dice against the enemy's dice, standard dice, pool behavior, adding together successes versus defenses, trying to do damage and wipe out massive amounts of enemies in one blow. Whereas I think Bardsung is much more reliant on your actual ability cards.
Yeah, it is. The abilities are really the only actions you're taking. There's no basic attack or anything like that. You're either moving, exploring, or using an ability. And when you use an ability to attack, it has a little bit of a hint of D&D to it. You're rolling a D20 against sort of the enemy. The enemy has very simplistic stats, and each enemy is going to have one stat in the upper left-hand corner that works for both their sort of offense and defense, whether they're being attacked or attacking. You're going to roll the D20 to see if you meet or exceed that. If you do, you get a hit. Great. If you get a hit, then you roll a die that keys off of your, let's flip this card, damage die right here. And I roll a D6. And if I meet or exceed their toughness, which is another stat, then I'm going to do a critical hit. And you can see on the Guiding Strike here, the hit is one thing, but the critical hit is just a little bit better. So even the hits and the critical hits have a little flavor to them. They're not just like, oh, you do double damage.
Yeah, it's much more of a deeper role-playing experience, I think, with Bardsung.
Yeah, for sure. These ability cards are really interesting. And I think, at least in the videos that I've watched of the game being played and the tutorial, they bring a lot more flavor to the game than just saying, I'm going to attack. And I don't know that you're just attacking in this.
Yeah, I mean, you have your weapons and your items that give you some flavor, and it's pretty satisfying to trigger off a series of abilities.
Well,
like
the dice pool thing is cool,
too.
But
yeah, but this is more about the dice pool.
Yeah.
Rolling those huge amounts of dice, right? That's the experience of Massive Darkness, and that's why I called it like an arcade-style game. Like, you're just constantly rolling, constantly moving through, beating everything up. You're going to struggle. You're going to have those, sections where you're just completely overwhelmed. But if you lose, it's pretty easy just to go back and restart. And you're just playing through a scenario. Yeah, you can have character progression within that scenario, and you're going to have it a lot. It's actually part of the game.
Yeah.
Like, you reach a certain point in the turn structure where you have to level up, get new abilities, get new access to some gear maybe that you weren't leveled up for enough before, but you're constantly leveling up. And then when you move from scenario to scenario, you can keep some of your items, but you basically are starting over with that character new. So it's definitely not the same kind of story that you're playing through like you are in Bardsung.
Yeah, Bardsung, there is character progression, but you're doing it in a far more limited basis. You gain experience throughout the scenario, or encounter as they call it, but it's not until the end of an encounter that you get to do any of those sorts of things. And when you do those sorts of things, you can do quite a bit. Like, for instance, in the tutorial, Dawn Guard starts with 2 abilities, but there are all these other ability cards that you can acquire, and a lot of these are all double-sided so that you can actually even level those up. So there's quite a bit of a feeling of building this character throughout the scenario. Even some of the enemies behave that way. Some of the enemies, once you do 2 damage, they're removed, but some of them are double-sided cards, so when you do damage, you flip them over, and now they're behaving differently, and you have to do another 2 damage.
Again, much more of a role-playing experience.
Yeah.
Also, and there's no GM or anything for Bardsung, but it does guide you kind of through branching storyline paths. Even within one particular scenario, you could go in multiple different directions and sometimes come out in multiple different endings. Even.
Yeah, there's even in one encounter, you might see 2 places to exit. And you can go to those directions. There might be some areas that aren't even towards the exit, but there's a narrative number next to it, and you're like, oh, I wonder what that's about.
Right.
Or it might have 2 treasure tokens, because you do see that. You see the fact that this area is going to have this. And when you do that, you're playing a whole nother session where you're trying to move across that board. So each chapter in this is actually not just typically one session. Each chapter is as many as like maybe 4 or 5 sessions, or as few as 2 or 3.
Yeah, I think so. Like the length of gameplay, like the gameplay experience in Massive Darkness is much more about that replayability, playing some of your scenarios over and over again with different character combinations, doing them more efficiently, having fun, playing through those. And you can get a lot of hours of content from these 10 scenarios, playing them over and over again, because they aren't long and overdrawn. They don't overstay their welcome. You'll want to try these different character concepts with the different components. So you'll want to play them over again. Bardsung's, I think, is more just in going through that huge campaign.
It's probably a bit more of a commitment. Now, with that said, it's still mechanically very simple. It kind of comes down to whether or not you want that sort of simple dice chucking type of experience in a game that you can get in and out of, or a game. Now, you can get in and out of this, but once you get in it, the next time you play, you want to play the next thing. So you want to try to keep that group of players together and things like that. So that's going to be part of the Bardsung experience.
Which people do. I mean, I've never been one of those people. Bardsung is the type of game I've played before where I say, this is going to be the time. This is the group that plays through the entire campaign, and we get maybe 5 or 6 sessions in, and then life happens, right? But I know people that make this a big part of their social life. Mm-hmm. They get together with the same people, sometimes even multiple times a week, and I'll check in with them. How far are you? Oh, we're now on scenario 30 or 50. And I'm like, wow, you've really powered, you're really getting through that. And that's a really cool experience, I think, to go through that storyline with friends and kind of build bonds with them as you're playing through a giant campaign.
And I think what Bardsung has going on for it, for encouraging people to continue on, are those simple mechanics.
Yeah.
So there's not much you have to remember. I think a big hurdle for a lot of people is they get away from the game for a little bit, and then they go back and someone's like, I have to kind of learn this whole thing again.
What were we doing? How did we play this game?
There's probably a little bit of that, but I can tell you there's just a few things you're doing on your turn, so once everyone sits down at the table again, I think they can pick it back up pretty easily. Now, the one last thing I wanted to talk about before we go is the price point.
I mean, I think that's an important part to evaluate. I mean, it's got to be.
When we're comparing, we don't usually talk about price points on the channel, but I think when we're comparing games like this, like we have been with these two, it's important to point out one is more expensive than the other. Massive Darkness, I think, and these are the base games that you can get right now if you go online and look. So it doesn't have all the Kickstarter extras or anything like that.
This is just the retail version, basically.
But Massive Darkness, as it sits right here, is about $100, I think. Just about anywhere you look, it's right around that price point. Bardsung, again, a lot more game to offer, but this has an MSRP of $200, and a lot of the sites that you can go to, the ones, are right around like $165, $170, something like that.
Yeah.
So there is a price difference, but like we said, I think you're going to, where you got 10 scenarios here, and
I don't even know, there's tons in that.
And a massive, more like, honestly, this is more of a Gloomhaven group sort of experience. Yeah. Now, the gameplay, not so much, but the breadth of the experience and the length of the experience is going to be more along those lines.
Yeah, when you boil it down to dollars per hour of entertainment, they're probably pretty close, because you'll probably get about half, maybe, depending on how much you play of this. And we're never going to tell anyone how to spend their money or what value is. Maybe somebody's like $300 for both. Let's do it. But for people that are trying to kind of decide between these, I think hopefully you maybe started to think that these were very similar games, but now you see that they're actually quite different. And I like that we can have two games that share even some basic principles, some basic mechanics, that then unfold to be very different experiences.
Yeah, and I think that's what we have here. We're actually going to play a little bit of both. Mm-hmm. We're going to do content for at least one of them. We might do content for both of them.
Declare a winner?
I don't know if we're going to, maybe we'll declare a winner, but we're going to do some content for both of these, or if not, just one of them. But we're going to play both of them here shortly and kind of figure out which one we want to dive into a little bit more. But if you have any questions until then, please make them in the comments below. We'll try to answer whatever we can.
Yeah, definitely.
We don't know too much about the games yet, but hopefully by the time you ask, we'll have played them a little bit more. But as always, until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then. Congratulations, you got to the end of one of our videos. Now, if you want more practice, just click on the video over here. It's another video. You might not have seen it yet, so click on it. If you don't want to do that, at least click on the subscription button below. That always helps us. And if you want notifications, please ring that bell.